And now for something completely different.
Ahoy catchphrase. I'm sure I'll find a better one at some point, but for now it suffices. This script began its life as an elevator pitch for a video game idea I've wanted to make real since I was about 10. But as my adult mind is wont to do, as I was mulling over how best to represent my idea, a thought for another video I've been meaning to make for some time now, but for lack of a suitable presentation vehicle, also seemed to fall right in line with it. So you're essentially getting 2 videos for the price of one today. Now, for a quick bit of personal backstory, so you can understand where I was coming at this from. You see, I'm just old enough to have grown up in a time before video games were mainstream forms of entertainment. And as I'm sure any regulars to my channel can readily imagine, as a child I was into just about every stereotypical boyish subject of interest you can imagine. From cowboys and knights to Star Wars, G.I. Joe, Transformers, trains, planes, dinosaurs, you name it. At the same time, my little sister had pretty much all the most common girlish interests in the book, with the caveat that, like me, she was also an artsy nerd, with particular emphasis placed on any and all things pertaining to animals, Pokemon and My Little Pony being the defaults for a long while, as I recall. The issue this presented my prepubescent self was that whenever she and I would play together, which with us being both socially awkward nerds with no friends, and this being just before the birth of the modern internet, was very often. As the older sibling, it was incumbent upon me to bridge the interests gap so as to not incur our parental wrath by causing a tantrum. My standard MO for achieving this was to concoct various combinations of her love of cute, cuddly animals with my boyish inclinations toward exploration and violence, which, being an avid dinosaur enthusiast, was rarely very difficult. My default mold for this was variations on the premise of the heroic ninja, Jedi, commando figure rescues the caged dinosaurs from the evil stormtroopers, most often performed by me for her enjoyment using our combined collections of 3 3/4-inch action figures and stuffed animals, sometimes in the style of a linear, leveled hack-and-slash platformer in the vein of some of my favorites from the period. Basically, think Dino Defender meets The Force Unleashed. Alright, but what does any of this have to do with the video's title? Well, to explain, I want to draw your mind back to whenever this Reddit post was going viral of a woman saying she accidentally ruined her relationship by trying to compliment her boyfriend, saying that she viewed him more as husband than hookup material. To which the general consensus, among both men and women, was that she was completely objectively correct in her self-assessment, that she just torpedoed her relationship by accidentally saying the quiet part out loud, and that if this guy had any self-respect, she'd never see or hear from him again. As any marketer or salesperson will readily tell you, communication's about what's heard, not what's meant. And what he'd heard in his girlfriend's drunken admission was that she wasn't really attracted to him so much as his utility, as that's what separates a husband from a hookup. Now, the question I never saw anyone even ask, let alone answer, when this thing was making its inaugural rounds was, assuming she was being genuine in her attempts at flattery and not passive-aggressive, then what could have possessed her to think that telling her boyfriend that he was, at best, her second choice of mate was a compliment? Well, my theory is that, had he said that to her, that she was made for marriage, not a brothel, that's how she would have perceived it. And so she just projected that reaction onto him, only to get a very different reaction on account of the fundamentally different ways in which men and women relate to the concepts of sex and marriage. And before anyone accuses me of having a one-sided bias on this, an equal and opposite example from the men's side is when guys, particularly younger or less experienced ones in the ways of sex and dating, unironically say to their subjects of desire some sappy hallmark line like, "You're my one and only," or "You complete me," or "I can't live without you." What she hears whenever her man says any variation on these is, "You're my one/only option," which is the single quickest way to turn a woman off your scent short of telling her that you cry whenever you think about puppies. The unfortunate problem we're looking at here is that because we've all been conditioned to believe that men and women are equal, by which I mean functionally interchangeable, he projects his own wish to hear such burning rhetoric from her onto her, and so ends up sending the opposite to his intended signal with predictable results. Now, the reason I bring up gender politics in a video ostensibly about childhood make-believe is that this is what I want to use this moment to address: the problems of make-believe. That is, people deliberately warping theirs and their children's perceptions of reality for the sake of upholding a preferred narrative. The easiest example of which I can think of is how our favorite childhood movies, particularly those of the actually good Disney Pixar variety, have distorted our ideas about nature, of animals, and of ourselves in relation to them. Take, for instance, old movies like Bambi, Fox and the Hound, 101 Dalmatians, and Spirit, Stallion of the Cimarron. These and their ubiquitous otherkin have trained multiple generations to anthropomorphize, that is, to ascribe human-like thought patterns to non-human animals which they don't possess. And while I won't say that promoting empathy towards other creatures isn't a positive thing, I shouldn't need to tell you of the massive risks inherent in teaching people, especially children, to view, and consequently to treat things as other than what they actually are. To treat the farmer who guards his livelihood from the wild rabbit or the fox as the bad guy simply because he's not cute and fluffy inadvertently instills in the viewer a strong sympathy for vulnerability. I say vulnerable because the reason we find things cute is that they share physical characteristics of human infants, thus eliciting in us the same parental instinct to coddle and nurture, even when the creatures in question are fully mature adults. Which leads to problems that can just as often include humans winning Darwin Awards as getting an animal put on a naughty list for no other crime than simply acting out its nature too near to a human, too thick to know their own place in the natural order. And therein lies the structural core of this video's little micro-thesis. The 20th century philosopher Theodore Adorno said that the most dangerous man in America was Walt Disney. He said this because Disney, as both a man and a company, sold people hope. While I disagree with the notion that hope is inherently a problem, I've often pinpointed it myself as the progenitor of delirium, which I've also previously defined as optimistic delusion. And this, I believe, is the core of all our modern woes, as it is root of magical thinking, which is the idea that thoughts not merely dictate, but also generate reality rather than the reverse. And while any attempt to distill the whole body of reality down into a finite set of axiomatic terms and conditions may easily be written off as hopelessly naive and futile, in my view, there are 5 big, noble myths, which for the sake of brevity, I'll let you pause and read on screen if you wish, that are the friendly-sounding and, on an emotional level, sometimes even sensible-sounding offspring of a directionally challenged worldview of a culture too high on its own princely press to see past the nose of its own high horse. Now, I've already quite thoroughly outlined the roots, functions, and failures of these critical masses of intellectual failure in other videos, so I'll not waste your time or my energy rehashing them in this one. Instead, it's their cancerous progeny, hypocrisy, gaslighting, and fiat, which are the proverbial white horse for any human relationship, no matter its size, weight, dimension, or nature, that I wanted to use this video's topical platform to address. Across the board, regardless of race, ideology, religion, nationality, ethnicity, or political creed, we've seen hypocrisy nuke otherwise formidable alliances into oblivion when the narrative and reality of a society contradict, when arbitrary authority is then subsequently used in place of genuine trust in and respect for established authority, and when the ruling powers attempt to hide their culpability, their lies, and their overt abuse of their powers and of their people's trust by inventing elaborate conspiracies by nebulous cabals whose sole end and aim, apparently, is to prove them wrong and undermine their divinely gifted authority. These are all symptoms of a necrotic social order, one that is already dead, but still shambling about on its old bones, its old tendons and ligaments, black and rotting from the inside out, still struggling to hold on to its decrepit flesh. A few examples of this I've personally seen are with the anti-theism movement of the 2010s and teens, wherein a group of young radicals, by the new powers vested in them by the still mostly unrestrained global communications hub of the internet, dissected and pulled apart the old religion stories and dogma they'd been force-fed as children. Around the same time, thanks to those same tenebrous digital forces, the manosphere, and with it, the red pill, and all of its unveiled truths about the nature of intersexual relationship dynamics set ablaze the decaying old house of cards that the Western dating, mating, and marriage scene had already become. And of course, we can't forget about the whole American dream bit we've all been sold, only to then realize we'd all been sold out back in 2008, and then subsequently reminded of again in 2020. Basically, once people realized that what they'd been taught all their lives to believe about the world, about themselves, and about each other was not merely wrong, but 180 degrees from right, they came upon what the Christians would call a crisis of faith, during which they could either choose to remain honest or to keep up the delusion, to keep the faith, as it were, to blindly sit and pray that all would somehow magically turn all right again. Those who know better are now finally standing up, And this is good. Now we're in a battle of wills between those who would prefer to serve in heaven and those who would rather reign in hell. Only time will tell which way the world ultimately turns, I suppose. But that's just been my thoughts on the matter. Let me know yours in the usual ways and places. And while you're down there, also be sure to do all the other YouTube things that please the Omniscience. Consider checking out my books on Amazon if you like my style of bizarre exoticism. And until next time, stay safe, stay sane, and remember to keep your mind open, not empty. Peace be upon you.